The gavel felt heavier than usual in my hand as I looked down at the case file that had just been placed before me. Case number 2024, CR 8847. The defendant's name stared back at me in bold black letters, Linda Marie Hawkins. My breath caught in my throat as 28 years of carefully constructed emotional walls began to crumble. The woman who had abandoned me for methamphetamine when I was 7 years old was about to stand before my bench, charged with possession with intent to distribute and child endangerment. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Jenny Catherine Morrison, and at 35 years old, I had spent the last 8 years as a district court judge in Phoenix, Arizona. The path to this moment had been paved with foster homes, scholarship applications written by candlelight, and an unwavering determination to never again be the helpless child watching her mother choose drugs over her daughter's basic needs. What I never anticipated was that the very system I had dedicated my life to serving would place my greatest personal trauma directly in my hands. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in late September. I arrived at the Maricopa County courthouse at 7:30, 2 hours before my first hearing, carrying my usual thermos of black coffee and the leather briefcase that had belonged to my law school mentor, Professor Elizabeth Garrett. The briefcase was one of the few possessions I truly cherished, not for its material value, but for what it represented: the transformation from a discarded child to a respected jurist who wielded the power to protect others from the very abandonment I had endured. My chambers overlooked the bustling streets of downtown Phoenix, where the early morning sun cast long shadows between the glass towers that housed law firms, government offices, and corporate headquarters. The view served as a daily reminder of how far I had traveled from the decrepit trailer park in Mesa where I had spent my earliest years watching my mother, Linda, disappear into a haze of drug-induced oblivion while I learned to fend for myself. The childhood memories were fragments I had spent years learning to compartmentalize. Linda was cooking methamphetamine in the kitchen while I ate cereal for dinner. Linda disappeared for days at a time, leaving me alone with nothing but expired food and the constant fear that she might never return. Linda chose her dealer boyfriend over her daughter's safety, moving us from one dangerous situation to another as her addiction consumed what remained of her maternal instincts. The breaking point had come on a scorching July afternoon when I was 7 years old. Linda had been missing for 3 days, and I had run out of food. The electricity had been shut off, and I was surviving on warm tap water and stale crackers I had found in the back of a kitchen cabinet. When Child Protective Services finally arrived, following a neighbor's report about a child wandering alone outside the trailer, they found me weighing 42 pounds and suffering from severe malnutrition. Linda had returned that evening to find her daughter gone and her trailer surrounded by official vehicles. According to the CPS report I would read years later during law school research, she had screamed that I was her property and that no one had the right to take me away. But when given the choice between entering rehabilitation and regaining custody, or maintaining her relationship with methamphetamine, Linda had made her decision clear. She signed away her parental rights 6 months later, choosing the temporary high over permanent responsibility for the child she had brought into the world. The foster care system had provided safety and structure that my biological home had never offered. My first placement was with Robert and Susan Chen, a Chinese-American couple in their 50s who had been fostering children for over a decade. They lived in a modest ranch house in Tempe, where Susan worked as a pediatric nurse, and Robert taught mathematics at the local community college. Their home represented everything mine had lacked: regular meals, consistent bedtimes, homework help, and adults who prioritized children's needs over personal desires. The Chens had recognized my academic potential despite the educational gaps created by years of chaos and neglect. Susan would sit with me for hours each evening, patiently helping me catch up on reading skills while Robert introduced me to mathematical concepts that opened entirely new ways of thinking about problems and solutions. They never promised permanence, but they provided something far more valuable: the foundation for believing that stability and success were possible for someone like me. My academic performance improved dramatically under their care. Within 2 years, I had advanced from reading at a 3rd grade level to testing above grade level in all subjects. The Chens arranged for me to participate in accelerated programs and academic competitions that built confidence while expanding my understanding of educational possibilities I had never imagined. When the Chens retired from fostering, they had arranged for my placement with another carefully selected family rather than allowing me to be transferred randomly through the system. Patricia and James Whitfield were both attorneys who had postponed having children while building their careers but had decided to foster teenagers who were aging out of the system. They lived in a comfortable suburban home in Scottsdale, where Their extensive library became my sanctuary, and their legal dinner conversations sparked my initial interest in the justice system. Patricia specialized in family law, representing children in custody disputes and abuse cases that reflected circumstances similar to my own background. Her work provided insight into how the legal system could protect vulnerable children while holding irresponsible adults accountable for their failures. James practiced criminal defense, and his stories about courtroom procedure, legal research, and constitutional principles fascinated me in ways that surprised everyone, including myself. The Whitfields had encouraged my interest in law by arranging summer internships at their respective firms and introducing me to other legal professionals, who became mentors and advocates for my educational advancement. Patricia would bring me to court hearings where I could observe family law proceedings, while James explained criminal procedure and constitutional protections that formed the foundation of American justice. My high school years were marked by academic excellence and extracurricular achievements that positioned me for competitive college admissions. I maintained a perfect grade point average while participating in debate teams, mock trial competitions, and volunteer work with organizations that supported children in foster care. The combination of personal experience and academic preparation created a unique perspective that college admissions committees found compelling. Arizona State University had offered me a full academic scholarship that covered tuition, housing, and living expenses. The scholarship was specifically designed for former foster children who demonstrated exceptional academic potential and commitment to public service. The financial support eliminated barriers that prevented many foster children from pursuing higher education, while the program's mentorship component provided ongoing guidance throughout my undergraduate studies. My college years were focused intensively on pre-law coursework and political science studies that prepared me for law school admission. I majored in criminal justice with a minor in psychology, combining academic study with internships at legal aid organizations and victim advocacy groups. The coursework provided theoretical understanding of legal principles, while the practical experience demonstrated how those principles affected real people facing circumstances similar to my own childhood. The law school admission test had seemed like an insurmountable obstacle until I discovered my natural aptitude for logical reasoning and analytical thinking. Months of preparation and practice testing resulted in a score that qualified me for admission to several prestigious law schools, including Stanford, Georgetown, and the University of Chicago. Each acceptance letter represented validation that foster children could achieve success that transcended their difficult beginnings. I chose the University of Chicago Law School because of their clinical program emphasis and their reputation for producing public interest attorneys who dedicated their careers to social justice causes. The decision meant moving far from Arizona and the support system I had built, but it also represented the independence and self-determination that had motivated me throughout my academic journey. Law school was intellectually demanding in ways that energized rather than overwhelmed me. Constitutional law, criminal procedure, and family law courses connected directly to my personal interests while expanding my understanding of how legal systems could address systematic problems affecting vulnerable populations. My professors recognized my unique perspective and encouraged me to pursue judicial clerkships that would provide insight into courtroom operations from the judge's perspective. Professor Elizabeth Garrett became my primary mentor during law school, recognizing my potential for judicial service and providing guidance about career paths that could lead to appointment to the bench. She had served as a federal magistrate before transitioning to academic work, and her combination of practical experience and theoretical knowledge provided invaluable preparation for my future career objectives. My law school clinical work focused on representing children in dependency court proceedings, where I advocated for foster children facing circumstances similar to my own background. The work was emotionally challenging but professionally fulfilling, as it provided opportunities to use legal training to protect children who had no other advocates. The experience reinforced my commitment to pursuing a career in public service rather than private practice. Upon graduation, I had been offered positions at several prestigious law firms, but I chose to begin my career as an assistant district attorney in Maricopa County, where I could prosecute crimes against children while building trial experience that would prepare me for eventual judicial appointment. The salary was significantly lower than private practice opportunities, but the work aligned with my personal mission and professional objectives. My prosecutorial career had been marked by successful convictions in cases involving child abuse, domestic violence, and drug-related crimes that destroyed families and communities. I specialized in cases where children were victims or witnesses, bringing personal understanding to professional responsibilities while maintaining the emotional detachment necessary for effective advocacy. The transition from prosecutor to judge had occurred after 7 years of trial experience and community involvement that demonstrated my commitment to justice and public service. Governor Rebecca Martinez had appointed me to fill a vacancy on the district court bench, recognizing my qualifications and background as assets that would enhance the court's ability to address cases involving family dysfunction and child welfare. My judicial philosophy emphasized protection of vulnerable individuals while holding offenders accountable for their choices and actions. I had presided over thousands of cases involving drug possession, domestic violence, child abuse, and family disputes, always maintaining professional objectivity while drawing upon personal experience to understand the human impact of legal decisions. The irony of my career trajectory was not lost on me. The child who had been abandoned by a drug-addicted mother had become the judge who sentenced drug offenders and decided custody cases involving children at risk. The work provided both professional satisfaction and personal healing, as each protective order issued and each custody modification granted represented a victory for children who deserved better than the adults responsible for their care. But nothing in my professional experience had prepared me for the moment when my court clerk, Maria Rodriguez, placed Linda Hawkins' case file on my desk. The name that I had spent years learning to say without emotion was suddenly staring back at me from official court documents that detailed charges eerily similar to the behaviors that had destroyed our relationship 28 years earlier. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. According to the preliminary police report, Linda had been arrested during a raid on a methamphetamine distribution operation in Mesa. Officers had found her in possession of over 2 ounces of methamphetamine along with scales, plastic bags, and other paraphernalia indicating intent to distribute. More disturbing was the presence of her 7-year-old grandson, Tyler, who had been living with her while his father served overseas military deployment. The child endangerment charges reflected circumstances that mirrored my own childhood experience. Tyler had been found malnourished and living in squalid conditions while Linda focused on drug activities that generated income to support her continued addiction. The parallel between Tyler's situation and my own childhood was so precise that it felt like confronting a nightmare I thought I had left permanently in the past. Linda was now 53 years old, and the booking photograph clipped to her file showed the devastating physical toll that decades of methamphetamine use had inflicted upon the woman who had once been my mother. Her face was gaunt and prematurely aged, her eyes hollow and unfocused, her once brown hair now gray and brittle. She barely resembled the young woman whose scattered childhood memories I still carried. The realization that Linda had never overcome her addiction, that she had continued making the same destructive choices that had cost her custody of me, created a complex mixture of vindication and profound sadness. Part of me felt validated that my 7-year-old assessment of her priorities had been accurate, while another part grieved for the mother she had never become and the grandmother she was failing to be for Tyler. As I reviewed the case details, I understood that I faced an unprecedented ethical and professional challenge. Judicial ethics required me to recuse myself from any case where personal relationships or conflicts of interest could compromise my objectivity. But Linda Hawkins was not just any defendant, she was the woman whose choices had shaped every aspect of my life, whose abandonment had motivated my career, and whose continued destructive behavior now threatened another innocent child. The weight of this moment was overwhelming in ways I had not anticipated. 28 years of careful emotional management, professional success, and personal growth had culminated in this singular confrontation with the past I thought I had transcended. The foster child who had been discarded was now the judge who would determine consequences for the woman who had discarded her, and in that moment, sitting alone in my chambers with Linda's case file open before me, I realized that everything I had worked to become, every scholarship earned, every case won, every judicial decision rendered, had somehow led to this unexpected reckoning with the woman who had chosen drugs over her daughter's most basic needs. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following morning at 9 o'clock. In less than 24 hours, Linda Hawkins would stand before my bench, and for the first time since I was 7 years old, we would be in the same room together. But this time, the balance of power would be completely reversed. This time, I would be the one making decisions about her future. The sleepless night that followed my discovery of Linda's case file was filled with research into judicial ethics, protocols and legal precedents that might guide my decision about recusal. My home office, with its floor-to-ceiling law books and framed judicial commissions, became a war room where I analyzed every possible angle of this unprecedented situation. The complexity extended far beyond simple conflict of interest rules into uncharted territory where personal history intersected with professional responsibility in ways that legal textbooks had never contemplated. Arizona's Code of Judicial Conduct required judges to recuse themselves when their impartiality might reasonably be questioned due to personal knowledge of disputed facts or when they had served as an attorney in the matter. But the code had been written with traditional conflicts in mind: financial interests, prior legal representation, or close personal relationships with parties or attorneys. No one had anticipated a scenario where a judge would preside over the criminal trial of the parent who had abandoned them decades earlier. My initial research into similar cases revealed only a handful of precedents from other jurisdictions, none of which provided clear guidance for my situation. A Minnesota judge had recused himself from a domestic violence case involving his estranged brother, while a Texas judge had stepped aside when her former college roommate appeared before her court. But these cases involved ongoing relationships and recent contact, not the profound abandonment and decades-long separation that characterized my situation with Linda. The American Bar Association's Model Code of Judicial Conduct emphasized that recusal was required when a judge's impartiality might reasonably be questioned by objective observers. The standard focused on public perception rather than actual bias, recognizing that the appearance of impropriety could undermine confidence in judicial decisions even when judges believed they could remain objective. But determining what reasonable observers might think about my situation required understanding the complex dynamics of abandonment, foster care, and personal transformation that most people had never experienced. My analysis revealed three distinct ethical frameworks that could apply to Linda's case. The traditional conflict of interest model suggested automatic recusal based on the parent-child relationship, regardless of its dysfunctional nature or prolonged absence. The personal knowledge standard focused on whether my childhood experiences provided information about Linda's character or behavior that wasn't available through normal court proceedings. The appearance of impropriety standards considered whether public knowledge of our relationship would create reasonable doubt about my ability to render fair judgment. Each framework led to different conclusions about the appropriateness of my continued involvement in the case. The relationship-based model clearly mandated recusal, as biological relationships were presumptively disqualifying regardless of their functional status. The personal knowledge model was more complex, as my information about Linda's past behavior was both highly relevant to her current charges and potentially prejudicial in ways that violated due process protections. The appearance standard depended on public perception factors that were difficult to predict and might vary significantly based on community understanding of foster care experiences. The legal precedents I discovered revealed additional complexity around the definition of family relationships in judicial ethics. Most ethics codes assumed that parent-child relationships involved ongoing contact and mutual recognition, concepts that didn't apply to situations involving abandonment and termination of parental rights. Some jurisdictions had specific provisions addressing adoptions and blended families, but none contemplated scenarios where legal parent-child relationships had been severed through abandonment and state intervention. My research into Tyler's current situation through Child Protective Services records revealed disturbing parallels to my own childhood that complicated the ethical analysis further. Tyler's father, Staff Sergeant Michael Thompson, was deployed overseas with the Army's 82nd Airborne Division and had arranged for Linda to provide temporary care during his deployment. Thompson had no knowledge of Linda's drug use or criminal activities, having met her through online dating services where she had misrepresented her background and current circumstances. The CPS investigation had found Tyler living in conditions nearly identical to those I had experienced 28 years earlier. The trailer where Linda lived was filled with drug paraphernalia, had no working utilities, and contained only expired food and empty containers. Tyler had been surviving on convenience store snacks that Linda purchased irregularly, and he had missed over 40 days of school during the current academic year due to Linda's inability to maintain consistent transportation or schedules. Medical examinations conducted during Tyler's protective custody revealed evidence of neglect that mirrored my own childhood experiences. He was underweight for his age, showed signs of poor hygiene and dental care, and exhibited behavioral indicators of trauma and stress associated with living in chaotic, unpredictable environments. The pediatric psychologist's evaluation described Tyler as hypervigilant and anxious, demonstrating survival behaviors common among children who had learned they couldn't rely on adults for basic needs. The criminal charges against Linda reflected the sophisticated nature of her current drug operation, which extended far beyond the personal use that had characterized her addiction during my childhood. The methamphetamine distribution network involved multiple suppliers, regular customers, and financial transactions that generated substantial illegal income. Police surveillance had documented her activities over several months, recording sales transactions and identifying other participants in the drug distribution conspiracy. Detective Sarah Williams, the lead investigator on Linda's case, had compiled evidence that demonstrated Linda's central role in coordinating drug sales throughout the Mesa area. Phone records showed hundreds of calls to known drug users and dealers, while financial analysis revealed cash deposits and expenditures inconsistent with any legitimate income sources. The investigation had also uncovered evidence that Linda was using Tyler's presence to avoid police suspicion, as single mothers with children typically attracted less attention from law enforcement surveillance operations. The evidence against Linda included multiple controlled purchases conducted by undercover officers, surveillance footage of drug transactions, chemical analysis of seized methamphetamine, and testimony from cooperative witnesses who had participated in her distribution network. The prosecution's case was exceptionally strong, with multiple forms of corroborating evidence that would make conviction highly likely regardless of Linda's defense strategy or the judge assigned to her case. Assistant District Attorney Rachel Martinez had been assigned to prosecute Linda's case, and her reputation for thorough preparation and aggressive prosecution of drug crimes made her a formidable opponent for Linda's court-appointed defense attorney. Martinez specialized in cases involving child endangerment and drug distribution, bringing both legal expertise and personal passion to prosecutions that protected children from adults who prioritized drug activities over child welfare. Martinez's case preparation included extensive documentation of the conditions in which Tyler had been living, expert testimony about the effects of methamphetamine exposure on children, and evidence of Linda's deliberate choices to prioritize drug distribution over her grandson's basic needs. The prosecution strategy would focus on establishing a pattern of behavior that demonstrated Linda's fundamental unfitness for any parental or caretaking responsibilities. Linda's defense would be handled by Thomas Anderson, an experienced public defender who specialized in drug cases and had a reputation for creative defense strategies that challenged prosecution evidence and sought alternative sentencing options for clients struggling with addiction. Anderson's approach typically emphasized treatment over incarceration, arguing that addiction was a medical condition requiring therapeutic intervention rather than punitive criminal sanctions. The potential sentences Linda faced were substantial. Under Arizona's drug distribution statutes, particularly given the presence of a child in her home during drug activities, the possession with intent to distribute charges carried maximum penalties of 15 years in prison, while the child endangerment charges added additional years and mandated minimum sentences that limited judicial discretion in sentencing decisions. If convicted on all charges, Linda could face up to 25 years in prison with limited possibility for early release. The complexity of my ethical situation was compounded by my specialized knowledge of dependency court proceedings and child welfare systems that would determine Tyler's permanent placement. My background in family law and child advocacy provided insight into the bureaucratic processes Tyler would navigate, while my personal experience with foster care gave me a unique understanding of the emotional and practical challenges he would face during family reunification efforts or permanent placement procedures. My judicial colleagues had handled thousands of similar cases involving drug-addicted parents and endangered children, but none possessed my combination of legal expertise and personal experience with the specific circumstances Tyler was facing. This specialized knowledge could be viewed as either a valuable asset that would enhance my ability to make informed decisions or as prejudicial information that would compromise my objectivity and violate Linda's due process rights. The timing of Linda's case created additional complications, as Arizona was implementing new drug court programs designed to provide treatment alternatives to traditional criminal prosecution for nonviolent drug offenders. The drug court option could provide Linda with opportunities for rehabilitation and family reunification that hadn't existed during my childhood, but participation required admission of guilt and commitment to intensive supervision and treatment. Programs that many defendants found more challenging than traditional criminal sentences. My research into drug court effectiveness revealed mixed results that complicated decisions about appropriate sentencing recommendations. Some participants successfully completed treatment programs and achieved long-term sobriety, while others violated program requirements repeatedly and ultimately received enhanced criminal penalties for their failures. The success rates correlated strongly with participants' motivation levels and support systems, factors that were difficult to assess during initial eligibility determinations. Linda's psychological evaluation, conducted as part of her pretrial assessment, revealed the extensive damage that 28 years of methamphetamine use had inflicted upon her cognitive abilities and emotional regulation. The neuropsychological testing showed significant impairment in areas responsible for executive function, impulse control, and long-term planning, deficits that explained her inability to prioritize Tyler's needs over her immediate drug-related gratification. The evaluation also documented Linda's complete lack of insight into the impact her choices had on children in her care, both historically and currently. When questioned about my childhood and the circumstances that led to termination of her parental rights, Linda demonstrated remarkable denial and blame shifting, attributing her loss of custody to governmental overreach rather than her own behavioral choices. Her responses suggested that she viewed herself as a victim of circumstances rather than the architect of her own destructive decisions. Mental health assessments revealed underlying trauma and personality disorders that contributed to Linda's addiction patterns and relationship difficulties. The clinical psychologist identified borderline personality disorder characteristics, including fear of abandonment, unstable relationships, and chronic feelings of emptiness that she attempted to medicate through drug use. These psychological factors provided context for understanding Linda's choices but didn't diminish the harm she had inflicted upon children who depended on her for care and protection. The intersection of Linda's mental health issues, addiction, severity, and criminal behavior created a complex case that challenged traditional approaches to both criminal justice and therapeutic intervention. Her psychological profile suggested that successful treatment would require years of intensive therapy and medication management, while her criminal history indicated that she posed ongoing risks to children and communities that couldn't be ignored during sentencing considerations. As I concluded my ethical research and case analysis, I realized that my decision about recusal would establish important precedents for future judges facing similar conflicts between personal history and professional responsibility. The legal community would scrutinize my choice, using it to develop guidance for other judges who might encounter cases involving family members or personal experiences that complicated their judicial objectivity. The weight of this precedent-setting responsibility added another layer of complexity to my decision-making process. Choosing recusal would protect my own interests and eliminate potential ethical violations, but it might also suggest that judges with personal experiences related to case facts were automatically disqualified from hearing similar matters. Such a precedent could prevent judges with valuable personal insights from contributing their expertise to cases where their backgrounds might enhance rather than compromise their decision-making abilities. The alternative choice, remaining on Linda's case, would require extraordinary vigilance to ensure that my personal history didn't influence my judicial decisions inappropriately. It would mean confronting my deepest childhood trauma in the most public and professional setting possible, while maintaining the emotional equilibrium necessary for fair and impartial judgment. The risk of personal bias was significant, but so was the potential for bringing unique understanding to a case that exemplified the intersection of addiction, child welfare, and criminal justice. As dawn broke over Phoenix and I prepared for another day that would determine the trajectory of this unprecedented situation, I understood that every choice I made would carry consequences that extended far beyond Linda's individual case. The little girl who had once been powerless to protect herself from her mother's choices was now the judge who would decide how society would respond to those same destructive patterns continuing with another innocent child. The decision to remain on Linda's case rather than recuse myself required implementing unprecedented safeguards and documentation procedures that would protect both the integrity of the judicial process and my own professional reputation. I spent the early morning hours before court developing a comprehensive strategy that would ensure absolute transparency while maintaining appropriate judicial boundaries. Every interaction, every decision, and every consideration would need to be meticulously documented to withstand the scrutiny that would inevitably follow. My first call was to Chief Judge Patricia Brennan, whose 30 years of judicial experience and reputation for ethical leadership made her the ideal advisor for navigating this uncharted territory. Judge Brennan had mentored me during my transition from prosecutor to judge, and her guidance had been invaluable in developing my judicial philosophy and courtroom management skills. Her office at 7:15 in the morning reflected her legendary work ethic and commitment to judicial excellence. "Jenny, this is exactly the kind of situation that keeps ethics professors awake at night," Judge Brennan said after I explained the circumstances of Linda's case. "There's no clear precedent because the legal system assumes that parent-child relationships involve ongoing contact and mutual recognition. Your situation challenges fundamental assumptions about family dynamics and judicial conflicts." Judge Brennan's analysis focused on creating a framework that would allow me to proceed while protecting against legitimate ethical concerns. Her recommendation included appointing a special master to observe all proceedings, requiring written justification for every ruling, and establishing an appellate review process that would ensure my decisions could be challenged immediately, rather than waiting for post-conviction appeals. These extraordinary measures would create unprecedented transparency while acknowledging the unique nature of my situation. The special master position would be filled by retired Judge Harold Washington, whose distinguished career included oversight of complex criminal cases and expertise in judicial ethics. Judge Washington had served on the Arizona Supreme Court's Ethics Committee and had written extensively about conflicts of interest in judicial proceedings. His presence would provide real-time guidance while offering protection against potential claims of bias or impropriety. My second strategic decision involved comprehensive disclosure to all parties involved in Linda's case. Both the prosecution and defense teams would receive detailed written notification of my relationship to the defendant, along with documentation of the safeguards I had implemented to ensure fair proceedings. This disclosure would allow both sides to make informed decisions about whether to request my recusal or to proceed with confidence in the protective measures I had established. Assistant District Attorney Rachel Martinez arrived at my chambers for our scheduled conference at 8 o'clock, carrying a thick case file and wearing the focused expression that characterized her approach to serious criminal prosecutions. Martinez had built her reputation through meticulous case preparation and aggressive advocacy for victims, particularly children who had suffered abuse or neglect at the hands of adults who should have protected them. Judge Morrison, I've reviewed the disclosure documents you provided, and I want you to know that the prosecution has complete confidence in your ability to handle this case fairly, Martinez began. Your personal experience with similar circumstances may actually enhance your understanding of the evidence we'll be presenting about the defendant's impact on her grandson's welfare. Martinez's perspective reflected the prosecution's strategic calculation that my background would make me more likely to understand the serious nature of Linda's crimes and the long-term consequences of childhood neglect. Her team had prepared evidence demonstrating that Linda's behavior toward Tyler precisely mirrored patterns of parental abandonment and prioritization of drug activities over child welfare that characterized thousands of similar cases throughout Arizona. The prosecution's case strategy involved establishing Linda's deliberate choices to prioritize drug distribution over Tyler's basic needs, documenting the systematic nature of her neglect, and demonstrating that her behavior constituted willful child endangerment rather than simple negligence resulting from addiction. Martinez had assembled expert witnesses who would testify about the developmental impact of childhood trauma and the long-term consequences of exposure to drug-related activities during critical developmental periods. Defense attorney Thomas Anderson's response to my disclosure reflected his years of experience with ethical challenges in criminal defense work. Anderson understood that requesting my recusal might delay proceedings and could potentially result in assignment to a judge with less understanding of addiction-related issues and their impact on parenting capabilities. His strategic calculation favored proceeding with a judge who might be more receptive to treatment-oriented sentencing alternatives. Judge Morrison, my client's constitutional right to fair proceedings is protected by the extraordinary safeguards you've implemented, Anderson stated during our conference. The defense believes that your professional experience and ethical framework will ensure that Ms. Hawkins receives fair consideration of all relevant factors, including her struggles with addiction and mental health issues that have contributed to her current circumstances. Anderson's defense strategy would focus on Linda's underlying psychological issues and addiction history, arguing that criminal prosecution alone couldn't address the root causes of her behavior. His approach emphasized treatment and rehabilitation over punitive incarceration, seeking drug court placement or alternative sentencing that would provide opportunities for therapeutic intervention while protecting community safety and Tyler's welfare. The third component of my strategic approach involved comprehensive research into Linda's complete criminal and social services history since our separation 28 years earlier. This investigation would provide context for understanding her current charges while identifying patterns of behavior that might inform sentencing decisions. The research required coordination with multiple agencies and jurisdictions where Linda had lived and been arrested over the intervening decades. Linda's adult criminal history revealed a disturbing pattern of escalating drug-related offenses and repeated failures in treatment programs that had been offered as alternatives to incarceration. Her first adult arrest occurred just 2 years after losing custody of me, when she was caught possessing methamphetamine in Tucson. The charges were reduced to misdemeanor possession in exchange for completion of a court-ordered rehabilitation program that she abandoned after 3 weeks. Subsequent arrests in Phoenix, Flagstaff, and Yuma documented Linda's movement throughout Arizona as she sought new drug markets and attempted to avoid law enforcement attention focused on her activities. Each arrest involved increasingly sophisticated drug operations, from simple possession to sales to coordination of distribution networks that supplied methamphetamine to multiple communities throughout the state. The social services records revealed multiple occasions when Linda had been investigated for child endangerment involving other children in her care. These investigations typically occurred when Linda entered relationships with men who had children from previous relationships, creating opportunities for her to assume temporary caretaking responsibilities that she invariably failed to fulfill adequately. One particularly disturbing case from 15 years earlier involved Linda's relationship with Robert Martinez, a divorced father whose 8-year-old daughter spent weekends at their shared apartment. Social services investigation found evidence that Linda had been manufacturing methamphetamine in the apartment while the child was present, exposing her to toxic chemicals and dangerous equipment. Linda had avoided criminal charges by ending the relationship and moving to a different jurisdiction before the investigation concluded. The pattern that emerged from Linda's historical records showed consistent behavior across nearly 3 decades. Forming relationships with vulnerable adults who had children, gaining access to those children, prioritizing drug activities over child welfare, and abandoning situations when her behavior attracted official attention. Tyler's current situation represented the latest iteration of a behavioral pattern that had endangered multiple children while serving Linda's addiction and criminal enterprises. My investigation also revealed that Linda had been the subject of numerous police intelligence reports documenting her connections to major drug trafficking organizations throughout the Southwest. These reports indicated that her current distribution operation was significantly larger and more sophisticated than the isolated drug sales that had characterized her earlier criminal activities. She had evolved from small-scale user-dealer to coordinator of supply chains that moved substantial quantities of methamphetamine from Mexican cartels to street-level distributors. The financial investigation conducted by the Arizona Department of Revenue revealed that Linda had been operating a cash-based economy that generated substantial unreported income while she collected various forms of public assistance intended to support Tyler's care. Bank records showed irregular large cash deposits followed by immediate withdrawals, suggesting money laundering activities designed to obscure the illegal sources of her income. Federal agencies had also taken interest in Linda's activities due to the interstate nature of her drug operations and potential connections to organized crime networks. Drug Enforcement Administration records indicated that Linda had been identified as a person of interest in several ongoing investigations targeting methamphetamine distribution networks with connections to Mexican cartels operating throughout Arizona and neighboring states. The complexity of Linda's criminal enterprise raised significant questions about Tyler's safety beyond the immediate neglect and endangerment charges. Living in a location that served as a distribution hub for illegal drugs exposed Tyler to risks from other criminals, potential violence related to drug transactions, and possible retaliation from law enforcement or competing criminal organizations. These additional risk factors strengthened the case for permanent removal from Linda's custody while supporting enhanced criminal penalties for her endangerment of Tyler's welfare. My research into Tyler's current psychological and medical condition revealed the profound impact that living with Linda had already inflicted upon his development and emotional well-being. The psychological evaluation conducted by Dr. Amanda Foster, a specialist in childhood trauma, documented symptoms consistent with complex post-traumatic stress disorder resulting from chronic neglect and exposure to adult criminal activities that children couldn't understand or process appropriately. Dr. Foster's evaluation described Tyler as hypervigilant and anxious, demonstrating survival behaviors that indicated prolonged exposure to unpredictable and dangerous circumstances. His sleep patterns were severely disrupted, his academic performance had declined dramatically, and his social interactions reflected learned distrust of adults and fear of expressing needs or preferences that might result in abandonment or punishment. The medical evaluation revealed physical evidence of prolonged neglect that mirrored my own childhood experiences with Linda's care. Tyler was underweight for his age, showed signs of poor nutrition and dental hygiene, and had several untreated medical conditions that reflected Linda's inability to prioritize his health needs over her drug-related activities. These physical manifestations of neglect provided concrete evidence of criminal child endangerment that would be difficult for the defense to explain or minimize. Educational records from Tyler's school documented the decline in his academic performance and attendance that coincided with the period when he began living with Linda. Teachers reported that Tyler frequently arrived at school hungry, wore the same clothes for multiple days, and exhibited behavioral changes that suggested significant stress and trauma in his home environment. The school had made several attempts to contact Linda about Tyler's declining performance and concerning behaviors, but she had failed to respond to phone calls, letters, or requests for parent conferences. The parallel between Tyler's experiences and my own childhood created a powerful foundation for understanding the long-term consequences of Linda's continued behavioral patterns. Both Tyler and I had experienced the same cycle of neglect, prioritization of drug activities over child welfare, and exposure to adult criminal behaviors that children couldn't comprehend or escape. The similarity of circumstances provided compelling evidence that Linda's treatment of Tyler represented continuation of deliberate choices rather than situational factors or temporary difficulties. As I completed my comprehensive investigation into Linda's history and Tyler's current circumstances, I realized that the strategic approach I had developed would serve multiple purposes beyond simply managing my own ethical obligations. The extraordinary documentation and oversight procedures would create a permanent record of judicial decision-making in cases involving complex family dynamics and criminal behavior. This precedent could guide future judges facing similar ethical challenges while demonstrating that personal experience, when properly managed and disclosed, could enhance rather than compromise judicial effectiveness. The investigation had also revealed the sophisticated nature of Linda's current criminal enterprise and the serious risks that her activities posed to Tyler's immediate safety and long-term development. These findings would inform both the criminal prosecution and the dependency court proceedings that would determine Tyler's permanent placement, ensuring that all relevant factors would be considered in making decisions about his future welfare and Linda's criminal consequences. The methodical approach to gathering and analyzing evidence reflected my prosecutorial training and judicial experience, while the personal understanding I brought to interpreting that evidence represented the unique value that my background could provide to ensuring justice for both Tyler and the community that Linda's criminal activities had endangered. The strategic investigation had transformed a potential ethical liability into a comprehensive foundation for informed judicial decision-making that would serve all parties' legitimate interests while maintaining the highest standards of professional conduct. The morning of Linda's preliminary hearing arrived with unprecedented media attention that transformed the usually routine courthouse proceedings into a spectacle that would test every safeguard I had implemented. News outlets throughout Arizona had learned about the unique circumstances of a judge presiding over her biological mother's criminal case, creating intense public scrutiny that required additional security measures and careful management of courtroom access. The courthouse steps were lined with reporters, legal analysts, and advocacy groups representing various perspectives on judicial ethics and family dysfunction. Channel 12 News legal correspondent Victoria Hayes had broken the story 3 days earlier, after courthouse sources revealed the extraordinary nature of my relationship to the defendant. Hayes' initial report focused on the ethical implications and precedent-setting nature of my decision to remain on the case, but subsequent coverage had expanded to include sensationalized speculation about my motivations and Linda's history that threatened to turn serious legal proceedings into entertainment programming. The Arizona State Bar Association had dispatched a team of ethics observers to monitor the proceedings and evaluate whether my handling of the case maintained appropriate professional standards. Bar President David Richardson personally attended the hearing, recognizing that my decisions would influence future ethics guidelines and potentially affect public confidence in judicial independence and objectivity. The presence of official ethics monitors added gravity to proceedings that were already emotionally charged and legally complex. Special Master Harold Washington had arrived early to review final preparations and ensure that all protective protocols were functioning properly. His distinguished appearance and authoritative presence provided reassurance that the proceedings would maintain appropriate dignity despite the unusual circumstances and media attention. Washington's real-time oversight would offer immediate guidance if ethical issues arose during the hearing while creating a permanent record of decision-making processes for future review. Tyler's advocacy team had assembled in the courthouse family services area, coordinating between Child Protective Services, his military father's legal representatives, and the court-appointed guardian ad litem who would protect his interests throughout both criminal and dependency proceedings. The team included Dr. Amanda Foster, whose psychological evaluation would be crucial evidence in both the criminal case against Linda and the dependency proceedings that would determine Tyler's permanent placement. Staff Sergeant Michael Thompson had been granted emergency leave to return from his overseas deployment and participate in proceedings that would determine his son's immediate safety and long-term custody arrangements. Thompson's military legal assistance attorney, Captain Jennifer Walsh, had coordinated with civilian counsel to ensure that Tyler's father could effectively advocate for his son's welfare while managing the complex intersection of military service obligations and family crisis circumstances. The courtroom security arrangements reflected the high-profile nature of the case and potential safety concerns related to Linda's connections to drug trafficking organizations. Additional deputies were stationed throughout the courthouse, while specialized personnel monitored the gallery for signs of disruption or intimidation attempts that might compromise witness testimony or judicial proceedings. The enhanced security measures created an atmosphere of tension that underscored the serious nature of the charges and the broader implications of the case. Linda entered the courtroom wearing the standard orange detention uniform, accompanied by 2 guards and looking significantly different from the booking photograph I had studied just days earlier. The 3 days in custody had apparently forced withdrawal from methamphetamine, and her appearance showed the physical effects of detoxification combined with the stress of facing serious criminal charges. Her movements were unsteady, her hands trembled slightly, and her eyes showed the confusion and disorientation common among long-term methamphetamine users during early recovery periods. Defense attorney Thomas Anderson had positioned himself strategically to shield Linda from direct eye contact with me during her entry, recognizing that any emotional reaction between us could compromise the proceedings or provide ammunition for future appeals. Anderson's careful choreography reflected his understanding that successful defense strategy required managing not only legal evidence but also emotional dynamics that could influence jury perceptions and appellate review. Assistant District Attorney Rachel Martinez had prepared comprehensive opening statements that would establish the prosecution's case while addressing the unique circumstances surrounding my involvement in the proceedings. Martinez understood that public attention and legal scrutiny required her to present evidence with exceptional clarity and precision, leaving no doubt about the strength of criminal charges regardless of any personal dynamics between Linda and me. As I called the court to order, the weight of this moment settled upon everyone present. The courtroom fell silent except for the mechanical hum of recording equipment and the soft scratching of court reporters documenting every word spoken. During these historic proceedings, Linda raised her eyes to look directly at me for the first time in 28 years, and I saw recognition flicker across her face as she processed the reality that her abandoned daughter now held absolute authority over her immediate future. The prosecution's presentation of evidence began with Detective Sarah Williams' testimony about the investigation that had led to Linda's arrest. Williams described the months-long surveillance operation that had documented Linda's central role in a methamphetamine distribution network spanning multiple counties. Her testimony included recordings of drug transactions, financial analysis showing illegal income sources, and photographic evidence of the dangerous conditions in which Tyler had been living. Detective Williams' description of the raid that led to Linda's arrest painted a disturbing picture of child endangerment that extended far beyond simple neglect. Officers had found Tyler alone in a trailer filled with drug manufacturing equipment, toxic chemicals, and armed individuals who were conducting illegal activities around a 7-year-old child. The police had discovered Tyler hiding in a closet, apparently trained to conceal himself when law enforcement arrived at the residence. The evidence photographs shown during Williams' testimony documented living conditions that were shockingly similar to my own childhood memories of Linda's parenting. The trailer lacked basic utilities, contained rotting food and drug paraphernalia, and showed signs of recent methamphetamine manufacturing that had exposed Tyler to dangerous chemical fumes and fire hazards. The photographic evidence provided objective documentation of circumstances that I remembered subjectively from my own childhood experience. Chemical analysis testimony from the Arizona Department of Public Safety Crime Laboratory established that Linda had been manufacturing methamphetamine in the same location where Tyler slept and ate. Laboratory supervisor Dr. Karen Mitchell explained that methamphetamine production created toxic residues that could cause serious health problems for children, including respiratory damage, neurological impairment, and developmental delays that might not become apparent until years after exposure. The prosecution's financial evidence demonstrated that Linda had been generating substantial illegal income while claiming poverty to justify receiving public assistance benefits intended to support Tyler's care. Bank records showed cash deposits exceeding $50,000 over the previous 6 months, while welfare records indicated that Linda had been receiving food assistance, housing subsidies, and medical benefits based on claims of financial hardship and inability to support Tyler's basic needs. Assistant District Attorney Martinez's presentation included expert testimony from Dr. Robert Chen, a pediatric psychologist specializing in childhood trauma, who explained the long-term developmental consequences of exposing children to adult criminal activities and unpredictable living environments. Dr. Chen's analysis of Tyler's psychological evaluation revealed patterns of behavior consistent with chronic stress and trauma that indicated prolonged exposure to circumstances that no child should experience. The prosecution's case also included testimony from Tyler's elementary school principal, Maria Rodriguez, who described the dramatic decline in Tyler's academic performance and social behavior during the period when he lived with Linda. Rodriguez testified that Tyler frequently arrived at school hungry, wearing dirty clothes, and exhibiting signs of sleep deprivation that interfered with his ability to participate in educational activities or form appropriate relationships with teachers and classmates. Defense attorney Anderson's cross-examination strategy focused on challenging the prosecution's characterization of Linda's intent and mental capacity, arguing that her actions resulted from addiction and mental illness rather than deliberate child endangerment. Anderson presented evidence of Linda's long-standing psychological issues and substance abuse problems, arguing that criminal prosecution couldn't address the underlying medical conditions that contributed to her behavior. Anderson's examination of Linda's psychological evaluation revealed documented evidence of borderline personality disorder, chronic depression, and cognitive impairment resulting from decades of methamphetamine use. His expert witness, Dr. Patricia Williams, a forensic psychiatrist, testified that Linda's mental health conditions significantly impaired her judgment and decision-making abilities, making it difficult for her to understand the consequences of her actions or prioritize Tyler's needs over her immediate compulsions. The defense presentation included testimony from Linda's sister, Margaret Hawkins, who described their shared childhood of abuse and neglect that had contributed to Linda's subsequent psychological problems and addiction patterns. Margaret's testimony attempted to provide context for understanding Linda's behavior as continuation of learned dysfunction rather than deliberate criminal intent to harm Tyler. Margaret's testimony revealed disturbing family history that explained some of Linda's behavioral patterns while highlighting the intergenerational nature of abuse and neglect that had affected multiple family members. Their childhood had included physical abuse, sexual exploitation, and exposure to drug use that created trauma responses and coping mechanisms that persisted into adulthood. Margaret had overcome similar background circumstances through therapy and support systems that Linda had never accessed or sustained. The defense strategy also emphasized Linda's previous attempts at rehabilitation and her expressed desire to regain custody of Tyler through successful completion of treatment programs. Anderson presented evidence that Linda had enrolled in multiple treatment programs over the years, arguing that her repeated failures reflected the chronic nature of addiction rather than lack of motivation or genuine commitment to change. However, the prosecution's rebuttal effectively demonstrated that Linda's treatment participation had typically been motivated by legal requirements rather than genuine commitment to recovery. Martinez presented evidence that Linda had consistently abandoned treatment programs when legal pressure was removed, returning immediately to drug use and criminal activities that prioritized her addiction over any family responsibilities. The hearing's most dramatic moment occurred when Linda was asked to respond to the charges against her. As she stood to address the court, she looked directly at me with an expression that combined recognition, confusion, and what appeared to be genuine remorse. Her voice was barely audible as she spoke her first words to me in 28 years. "Your Honor, I know who you are," Linda said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I know what I did to you is wrong, and I know what I've done to Tyler is wrong too. I never meant for any of this to happen." The courtroom remained absolutely silent as Linda continued, tears beginning to flow down her face. "I see you sitting up there in that black robe, and I know you became everything I never could be. I'm proud of you for that, even though I don't have any right to be proud of anything about you. I gave up that right a long time ago." Her words created a moment of profound emotional intensity that tested every safeguard I had implemented to maintain judicial objectivity. The personal acknowledgement of our relationship and her recognition of my achievements created complex feelings that I had to suppress while focusing on my professional responsibilities to ensure fair proceedings. As the preliminary hearing concluded, with my decision to bind Linda over for trial on all charges, I realized that the system's response to this unprecedented case had demonstrated both the strength and flexibility of judicial institutions when faced with ethical challenges that existing protocols hadn't anticipated. The comprehensive oversight and documentation procedures had protected the integrity of proceedings while accommodating the unique circumstances that personal history brought to professional responsibilities. The media coverage following the hearing reflected intense public interest in the intersection of family dysfunction and judicial authority, while legal analysts debated whether my approach had established appropriate precedents or created dangerous departures from traditional ethical boundaries. The ongoing scrutiny would continue throughout the trial proceedings, ensuring that every decision would be evaluated not only for its immediate appropriateness but also for its long-term implications for judicial conduct and public confidence in court systems. Part 5. The Unraveling in Confessions. The 6 weeks between Linda's preliminary hearing and the beginning of her trial became a period of unprecedented legal maneuvering as defense attorney Thomas Anderson attempted to negotiate a plea agreement that would acknowledge his client's guilt while securing treatment opportunities rather than maximum incarceration. Anderson understood that Linda's emotional breakdown during the preliminary hearing had created both opportunities and risks for his defense strategy, as public sympathy for her circumstances had to be balanced against the overwhelming evidence of criminal behavior and child endangerment. Anderson's plea negotiation strategy centered on Linda's mental health issues and addiction history, arguing that traditional criminal prosecution couldn't address the underlying psychological conditions that had contributed to her decades of destructive behavior. His proposal involved Linda pleading guilty to reduced charges in exchange for mandatory participation in intensive drug treatment programs, psychological counseling, and supervised community service that would contribute to addiction recovery. Efforts throughout Arizona. The proposed plea agreement included permanent relinquishment of any future contact with Tyler or claims to custody rights, acknowledging that Linda's behavior had disqualified her from any parental or grandparental relationship that could endanger his welfare. Anderson argued that this voluntary surrender of family relationships demonstrated genuine remorse and commitment to preventing future harm to children who might come under Linda's influence. Assistant District Attorney Rachel Martinez's response to the plea proposal reflected her prosecutorial philosophy that serious crimes against children required meaningful consequences regardless of defendants' personal circumstances or expressions of remorse. Martinez argued that Linda's extensive criminal history and repeated failures in previous treatment programs demonstrated that therapeutic alternatives alone couldn't protect community safety or provide appropriate justice for Tyler's suffering. Martinez's counterproposal required Linda to plead guilty to all original charges while accepting a sentence that combined substantial incarceration with post-release treatment requirements and lifetime restrictions on contact with children. The prosecution's position emphasized that accountability must include punishment proportional to the harm inflicted upon Tyler and the broader community that Linda's drug distribution activities had endangered. The plea negotiations were complicated by new evidence that emerged during continued investigation of Linda's drug distribution network. Federal Drug Enforcement Administration agents had identified connections between Linda's operation and larger trafficking organizations that imported methamphetamine from Mexican cartels, potentially exposing her to additional federal charges that carried enhanced penalties under organized crime statutes. DEA Special Agent Michael Rodriguez had been monitoring Linda's activities as part of a broader investigation targeting methamphetamine distribution networks throughout the Southwest. Rodriguez's testimony during a closed hearing revealed that Linda had been identified as a mid-level coordinator who received regular shipments of methamphetamine from suppliers in Mexico and distributed the drugs to street-level dealers throughout Arizona and New Mexico. The federal investigation had documented Linda's participation in conspiracy activities that included money laundering, interstate transportation of illegal drugs, and coordination with known members of criminal organizations that operated across international borders. These additional criminal activities exposed Linda to federal prosecution under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, which carried potential sentences of up to 20 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. Agent Rodriguez's evidence included recorded phone conversations between Linda and her suppliers that demonstrated her sophisticated understanding of drug distribution operations and her deliberate choices to expand her criminal activities despite knowing the risks to Tyler's safety and her own legal exposure. The recordings revealed Linda discussing strategies for avoiding law enforcement detection while coordinating drug transactions around Tyler's school schedule and daily routines. The federal evidence also documented Linda's financial activities that involved structuring cash deposits to avoid banking reporting requirements and using Tyler's name and social security number to open accounts that concealed her illegal income sources. These financial crimes constituted identity theft and fraud charges that added years to potential sentences while demonstrating Linda's willingness to exploit Tyler for criminal purposes beyond simple neglect. The revelation of federal interest in Linda's case created additional pressure for plea negotiations, as federal prosecution would remove the case from state court and eliminate any possibility of the treatment-oriented sentencing that Anderson had been pursuing. Federal sentencing guidelines provided limited judicial discretion and mandated substantial incarceration for defendants convicted of drug trafficking and organized crime violations. During this period of legal maneuvering, Tyler's psychological treatment had begun revealing the full extent of trauma that his time with Linda had inflicted upon his emotional and cognitive development. Dr. Amanda Foster's ongoing therapy sessions documented symptoms of complex post-traumatic stress disorder that would require years of intensive treatment to address effectively. Tyler's trauma responses included hypervigilance, sleep disturbances, academic regression, and social withdrawal that interfered with his ability to form trusting relationships with adults. Tyler's father, Staff Sergeant Michael Thompson, had established temporary residence in Phoenix to participate in his son's recovery while coordinating with military authorities about modification of his deployment status. Thompson's involvement in Tyler's treatment revealed his shock and guilt about entrusting his son's care to Linda, whose background and current circumstances he had not adequately investigated before his overseas deployment. Thompson's testimony during custody proceedings provided insight into Linda's deceptive practices in establishing their relationship and gaining access to Tyler. Linda had misrepresented her background, employment status, and living circumstances through online dating platforms and had maintained false personas during their courtship that concealed her addiction and criminal activities. Thompson's military training had not prepared him to recognize sophisticated deception from someone he believed was a trustworthy potential partner. The custody proceedings revealed that Linda had targeted Thompson specifically because his military service created opportunities for unsupervised access to Tyler during deployment periods. Investigators discovered that Linda had researched military deployment schedules and had systematically pursued relationships with military personnel whose service obligations created single-parent situations that she could exploit for financial and housing benefits. This pattern of predatory behavior toward military families added another dimension to Linda's criminal activities and demonstrated calculated exploitation of national service members and their children. The evidence supported additional charges related to fraud and theft of military benefits, while highlighting the sophisticated nature of Linda's criminal planning that extended far beyond simple drug possession or distribution. As federal investigators expanded their examination of Linda's activities, they discovered evidence of her involvement in a complex scheme to manufacture false identity documents for illegal immigrants involved in drug trafficking operations. Linda had been using her trailer as a document production facility where she created fake social security cards, driver's licenses, and immigration documents that enabled cartel operatives to establish false identities for conducting criminal activities throughout the United States. The identity theft operation had generated substantial additional income for Linda while providing crucial support services for international drug trafficking organizations. Her expertise in document production had made her a valuable asset to criminal networks that required sophisticated false identification systems to avoid law enforcement detection and maintain operational security. FBI Document Analysis Unit examination of materials seized from Linda's trailer revealed evidence of hundreds of false documents that had been distributed to criminals throughout the Southwest. The sophistication of the document production operation indicated that Linda had received training and equipment from professional forgers connected to organized crime networks rather than operating as an independent criminal entrepreneur. Special Agent Sarah Martinez from the FBI's Criminal Investigative Division had been tracking Linda's document production activities as part of a broader investigation targeting identity theft networks that supported international drug trafficking operations. Martinez's testimony revealed that Linda's operation had been identified as a crucial component of criminal infrastructure that enabled Mexican cartels to establish permanent operational presence in American communities. The federal investigation had also uncovered evidence that Linda had been recruiting other single mothers and grandmothers to participate in drug distribution and document production activities, creating a network of women who used their relationships with children to avoid law enforcement suspicion. This recruitment operation demonstrated Linda's role as an organizer and trainer of criminal activities rather than simply a low-level participant in drug distribution. The expanded federal charges fundamentally altered the landscape of plea negotiations, as Linda now faced potential sentences exceeding 30 years in federal prison if convicted on all charges. The severity of federal penalties eliminated most of Anderson's negotiating leverage while creating powerful incentives for Linda to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for reduced sentences. Federal prosecutors offered Linda a cooperation agreement that would require her to provide comprehensive information about drug trafficking networks, identity theft operations, and other criminal activities she had participated in or observed during her years of involvement with organized crime networks. The cooperation agreement offered potential sentence reductions in exchange for testimony that could lead to prosecution of higher-level criminals and disruption of ongoing criminal enterprises. Linda's decision about whether to accept federal cooperation agreements created intense pressure from criminal associates who recognized that her testimony could expose their operations to law enforcement investigation and prosecution. Security concerns required Linda's transfer to federal detention facilities with enhanced protection capabilities, while investigators monitored communications and visitation to prevent intimidation or retaliation attempts. The cooperation negotiations revealed the extent of Linda's knowledge about criminal operations throughout the Southwest, as her involvement in drug distribution and identity theft had provided access to information about trafficking routes, cartel operations, money laundering schemes, and corruption of public officials that supported organized crime activities. During this period of federal investigation and plea negotiations, I maintained careful documentation of all communications and decisions related to Linda's case while consulting regularly with Special Master Harold Washington about the evolving ethical implications of her expanded criminal exposure. The federal charges had transformed a state court drug case into a complex organized crime prosecution that required additional safeguards and oversight procedures. The media attention surrounding Linda's case had intensified as details about her extensive criminal activities and federal charges became public knowledge. Legal analysts debated whether the revelation of her sophisticated criminal enterprise validated or complicated my decision to remain on the case, as the evidence demonstrated that her current situation extended far beyond the simple drug possession and child endangerment charges that had originally brought her before my court. Public opinion surveys conducted by local news organizations revealed strong support for severe criminal penalties for Linda's crimes against Tyler, while also expressing confidence in my ability to handle the case fairly despite our personal relationship. The public's response reflected understanding that Linda's criminal behavior warranted serious consequences regardless of any family dynamics or personal history that might complicate judicial proceedings. As the federal investigation continued expanding and Linda faced pressure to decide about cooperation agreements, the systematic breakdown of her criminal network began revealing the full scope of activities that had endangered not only Tyler but dozens of other children whose parents had been recruited into drug distribution operations. The investigation had uncovered a pattern of criminal exploitation that used children as shields against law enforcement while generating profits that supported international drug trafficking organizations. The revelation that Linda's criminal activities had endangered multiple children throughout Arizona created additional pressure for maximum sentences and comprehensive prosecution efforts that would protect community safety while providing justice for all victims of her criminal enterprise. The case had evolved from individual family tragedy into a complex organized crime prosecution with implications for national security and international drug enforcement cooperation. The federal courthouse in Phoenix became the setting for Linda's ultimate reckoning as she faced the most consequential decision of her criminal career: whether to accept a cooperation agreement that would require her to testify against dangerous cartel associates in exchange for a reduced sentence that could still result in 15 years of imprisonment. The weight of federal charges had eliminated any possibility of the treatment-focused resolution that her defense attorney had originally pursued, leaving only negotiations about the degree of punishment she would face for her extensive criminal activities. Linda's decision to accept the federal cooperation agreement came after 3 weeks of deliberation during which she remained in protective custody while federal marshals investigated credible threats against her life from criminal associates who feared her potential testimony. The cooperation agreement required her to provide comprehensive information about drug trafficking operations, money laundering schemes, document forgery networks, and corruption of public officials that she had witnessed during her years of involvement with organized crime activities. United States Attorney Janet Phillips announced Linda's cooperation agreement during a press conference that highlighted the case's significance for disrupting international drug trafficking operations and protecting children throughout Arizona from criminal exploitation. Phillips emphasized that Linda's testimony would enable prosecution of higher-level criminals while providing crucial intelligence about cartel operations that threaten national security and community safety throughout the Southwest. The cooperation agreement included Linda's guilty plea to 14 federal charges encompassing drug trafficking conspiracy, money laundering, identity theft, document fraud, and racketeering violations under the Organized Crime Control Act. The plea agreement specified a sentence range of 12 to 18 years in federal prison, followed by supervised release and lifetime restrictions on contact with children or participation in financial activities that could facilitate criminal enterprises. Linda's allocution during her federal plea hearing provided the first comprehensive public acknowledgement of her criminal activities and their impact upon Tyler and other children who had been endangered by her choices. Standing before Federal District Judge Robert Chen, Linda's voice trembled as she detailed the scope of her criminal enterprise and accepted responsibility for prioritizing illegal profits over the safety and welfare of children in her care. "I used my grandson Tyler as a shield to avoid police suspicion while I coordinated drug sales and document forgery operations," Linda testified. "I taught him to hide when law enforcement came to our home, and I exposed him to dangerous chemicals and violent criminals because I cared more about making money than protecting an innocent child who trusted me to keep him safe." Linda's confession revealed the calculated nature of her criminal activities and her deliberate exploitation of Tyler's presence to facilitate illegal operations. Her testimony documented systematic child endangerment that extended far beyond simple neglect to encompass deliberate use of Tyler as camouflage for criminal activities that generated substantial illegal income while exposing him to immediate physical danger and long-term psychological trauma. The federal sentencing hearing took place 6 weeks later in a courtroom filled with law enforcement officials, victim advocates, and media representatives who had followed the case's evolution from state court child endangerment charges to federal organized crime prosecution. Federal sentencing guidelines required consideration of Linda's cooperation value against the severity of her crimes and the harm inflicted upon victims, particularly Tyler, whose trauma would require years of treatment and recovery. Tyler's victim impact statement was read by his father, Staff Sergeant Michael Thompson, whose military bearing couldn't conceal the emotion in his voice as he described his son's ongoing struggles with nightmares, academic regression, and social withdrawal resulting from his time with Linda. Thompson's statement emphasized the long-term consequences of Linda's choices and the betrayal of trust that had endangered his son while he served overseas protecting American interests. "My son trusted the woman I believed was caring for him while I served my country," Thompson read from Tyler's statement. "Instead, she used him as a prop for criminal activities that could have killed him and traumatized him in ways that will affect his entire life. Tyler wants her to know that he forgives her, but he never wants to see her again because she chose drugs and money over keeping him safe." Dr. Amanda Foster's professional assessment of Tyler's psychological condition provided clinical documentation of the severe trauma that Linda's choices had inflicted upon her grandson's emotional and cognitive development. Dr. Foster testified that Tyler exhibited symptoms of complex post-traumatic stress disorder that would require intensive therapy, educational support, and ongoing monitoring to address effectively. The psychological damage represented a permanent consequence of Linda's criminal behavior that would affect Tyler's relationships, academic performance, and life opportunities for years to come. Federal prosecutors presented comprehensive evidence of Linda's criminal activities and their broader impact on community safety, international drug enforcement efforts, and the children who had been endangered by her recruitment of other parents into criminal enterprises. Assistant United States Attorney Kevin Walsh argued that Linda's sophisticated criminal operation had generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal profits while facilitating cartel operations that brought violence and addiction to communities throughout Arizona. The prosecution's sentencing memorandum documented Linda's central role in training other women to use their children as shields for drug distribution activities, creating a network of criminal exploitation that had endangered dozens of children while providing crucial support services for international trafficking organizations. The systematic nature of Linda's criminal enterprise justified enhanced penalties under federal guidelines that addressed ongoing criminal conduct and leadership roles in organized crime activities. Defense attorney Thomas Anderson's sentencing argument focused on Linda's cooperation with federal authorities and the valuable intelligence she had provided about cartel operations and official corruption that had enabled successful prosecutions of higher-level criminals. Anderson argued that Linda's assistance to law enforcement efforts demonstrated genuine remorse and commitment to preventing future harm to children and communities affected by drug trafficking operations. Anderson's memorandum included letters from addiction counselors and mental health professionals who had evaluated Linda during her federal detention and concluded that her criminal behavior resulted from severe psychological trauma and addiction issues that could be addressed through appropriate treatment and supervision. The defense argument emphasized rehabilitation over punishment, arguing that Linda's cooperation had already contributed more to community safety than additional incarceration would achieve. Federal District Judge Robert Chen's sentencing decision reflected careful consideration of Linda's cooperation value, the severity of her crimes, and the need for deterrent effects that would discourage similar criminal behavior by others who might consider exploiting children for criminal purposes. Judge Chen imposed a sentence of 16 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release and lifetime restrictions on contact with children or participation in financial activities that could facilitate criminal enterprises. Judge Chen's sentencing statement emphasized the calculated nature of Linda's crimes and her deliberate exploitation of children to facilitate criminal activities that generated substantial illegal profits while supporting international drug trafficking operations. The sentence reflected the serious harm Linda had inflicted upon Tyler and other children while acknowledging her cooperation with federal authorities in disrupting organized crime networks. Ms. Hawkins, your crimes represent a fundamental betrayal of the trust that children place in adults who are responsible for their care and protection, Judge Chen stated. You used your grandson and other children as shields for criminal activities that generated illegal profits while exposing them to immediate danger and long-term trauma that will affect their lives permanently. Your cooperation with federal authorities demonstrates some recognition of the harm you have caused, but it cannot undo the damage you have inflicted upon innocent children who deserve protection rather than exploitation. The federal sentence effectively eliminated any possibility of Linda maintaining future contact with Tyler or other children, as her supervised release conditions included lifetime restrictions on unsupervised contact with minors and mandatory participation in psychological treatment programs that would address the underlying issues that had contributed to her criminal behavior. Meanwhile, The state court proceedings that I had been overseeing concluded with Linda's formal withdrawal of her not guilty plea and acceptance of responsibility for the original child endangerment and drug possession charges that had brought her before my court. The state charges would run concurrently with her federal sentence, ensuring that all aspects of her criminal behavior would be addressed through comprehensive prosecution and appropriate punishment. My final ruling in Linda's state case included formal findings that her behavior toward Tyler constituted willful child endangerment that demonstrated unfitness for any future parental or caretaking responsibilities. The ruling established a permanent record of her criminal conduct that would prevent any future attempts to gain custody or unsupervised contact with children, while supporting Tyler's father's petition for sole custody and protection from Linda's influence. The conclusion of Linda's criminal cases also marked the resolution of the ethical challenges that had characterized my involvement in proceedings involving my biological mother. The comprehensive documentation and oversight procedures that I had implemented throughout the case provided a complete record of judicial decision-making that demonstrated appropriate professional conduct despite the unprecedented personal circumstances involved. The Arizona State Bar Association's ethics review concluded that my handling of Linda's case had established appropriate precedents for managing conflicts between personal history and professional responsibility. Bar President David Richardson commended the safeguards and transparency measures that had protected the integrity of judicial proceedings while accommodating the unique circumstances that personal experience brought to professional responsibilities. Special Master Harold Washington's final report documented the extraordinary measures that had been implemented to ensure fair proceedings and noted that the comprehensive oversight had actually enhanced rather than compromised the quality of judicial decision-making in Linda's case. Washington's conclusions would influence future ethics guidelines for judges facing similar conflicts between personal relationships and professional responsibilities. The media coverage of Linda's sentencing and the conclusion of state court proceedings reflected intense public interest in the intersection of family dysfunction and judicial authority. Legal analysts praised the systematic approach that had been used to manage ethical challenges while ensuring comprehensive prosecution of serious crimes against children and community safety. Tyler's recovery and adjustment to life with his father represented the most important outcome of the comprehensive legal proceedings that had addressed Linda's criminal behavior. Staff Sergeant Thompson had received reassignment to domestic duty that would allow him to focus on Tyler's ongoing therapy and educational needs while providing the stable family environment that Tyler needed for healing and development. Dr. Amanda Foster's ongoing treatment plan for Tyler included specialized therapy for childhood trauma, educational support to address academic regression, and family counseling to strengthen his relationship with his father while processing the complex emotions related to Linda's criminal behavior and imprisonment. The treatment plan acknowledged that Tyler's recovery would require years of intensive support but expressed optimism about his potential for overcoming the trauma and achieving normal development. The conclusion of Linda's criminal prosecutions had provided Tyler with the security of knowing that she could not endanger him again, while the permanent custody arrangement with his father offered the stability and protection that he needed for successful recovery. The legal system's comprehensive response to Linda's crimes had demonstrated that children's safety and welfare would be protected through appropriate prosecution and punishment of adults who chose criminal activities over their responsibilities to vulnerable children. As I reflected on the completion of the most challenging case of my judicial career, I recognized that the systematic pursuit of justice had achieved outcomes that protected Tyler's immediate safety while establishing precedents that would guide future cases involving complex family dynamics and criminal behavior. The personal dimension of Linda's case had been transformed into professional validation of the principles that had motivated my career in public service and child advocacy. The little girl who had once been powerless to protect herself from Linda's choices had become the judge who ensured that appropriate consequences followed her continued criminal behavior. The transformation from victim to protector represented the completion of a journey that had begun 28 years earlier when Child Protective Services had rescued me from Linda's neglect and provided opportunities for education, growth, and eventual service to others facing similar circumstances. 2 years after Linda's sentencing, the ripple effects of her case had transformed not only my own understanding of justice and family but had also influenced judicial practices, child protection policies, and federal law enforcement strategies throughout the United States. The unprecedented nature of a judge presiding over her biological mother's criminal case had generated sustained academic interest and policy development that extended far beyond the individual circumstances of Tyler's rescue and Linda's imprisonment. The National Center for State Courts had commissioned a comprehensive study of my case as part of their research into judicial ethics and conflict management in complex family situations. Professor Elizabeth Warren from Harvard Law School led the research team that analyzed every aspect of the safeguards and procedures I had implemented, ultimately concluding that personal experience, when properly managed through systematic oversight, could enhance rather than compromise judicial effectiveness in cases involving family dysfunction and child welfare. Professor Warren's research findings were published in the Yale Law Journal as part of a special issue addressing innovations in judicial ethics and courtroom management. Her article, titled "When Personal Experience Serves Justice: Redefining Judicial Conflicts in Child Welfare Cases," argued that judges with relevant personal backgrounds should be encouraged rather than automatically disqualified from cases where their experiences could contribute to more informed decision-making. The Harvard study had documented improved outcomes in child welfare cases when judges possessed personal understanding of foster care systems, family dysfunction, and childhood trauma. The research demonstrated that proper safeguards and transparency measures could transform potential conflicts into valuable assets for protecting vulnerable children while maintaining appropriate professional boundaries and public confidence in judicial institutions, based on the precedent established by my handling of Linda's case. The American Bar Association had developed new ethical guidelines that provided framework for judges to remain on cases involving personal relationships when extraordinary oversight measures could ensure fair proceedings. The new guidelines emphasized disclosure, documentation, and independent monitoring as alternatives to automatic recusal in situations where judicial experience and insight could benefit case outcomes. The ABA's Model Code of Judicial Conduct now included specific provisions addressing situations where judges' personal experiences intersected with professional responsibilities, recognizing that diverse backgrounds and life experiences represented valuable assets for judicial decision-making, rather than automatic disqualifications. The revised code required careful analysis of potential benefits and risks rather than presumptive recusal based solely on personal relationships or historical circumstances. My own professional development had been transformed through the experience of managing Linda's case and its aftermath. The National Judicial College had invited me to develop training programs for judges who faced ethical challenges involving personal relationships, family dysfunction, and complex conflict management. The training curricula I developed addressed both practical procedures and emotional management techniques that enabled judges to maintain professional objectivity while drawing upon personal insights that enhanced their understanding of case dynamics. The judicial training programs included modules on recognizing and managing personal biases, implementing extraordinary oversight procedures, and utilizing personal experience as a resource for understanding rather than prejudging case outcomes. The training emphasized that effective conflict management required systematic analysis and protective measures rather than avoidance of challenging situations that could benefit from judicial experience and insight. Speaking engagements at law schools and judicial conferences throughout the country had provided opportunities to share insights about the intersection of personal experience and professional responsibility while advocating for innovative approaches to judicial ethics that accommodated the diverse backgrounds and experiences that judges brought to their work. The presentations emphasized that judicial diversity included experiential diversity that could enhance rather than compromise decision-making when properly managed. The University of Arizona James E. Rogers College of Law had established the Morrison Institute for Judicial Innovation, named in recognition of my contributions to developing new approaches to judicial ethics and conflict management. The institute conducted research into best practices for managing complex ethical situations while providing training and consultation services for courts facing unprecedented challenges involving personal relationships and professional responsibilities. Tyler's recovery had progressed remarkably under his father's care and the comprehensive therapeutic support that had been arranged following Linda's conviction. Dr. Amanda Foster's ongoing treatment had successfully addressed many of the trauma symptoms that had initially appeared overwhelming. While Tyler's academic performance had returned to age-appropriate levels and his social interactions had normalized significantly, Staff Sergeant Thompson had completed his military service and transitioned to civilian employment that allowed him to focus entirely on Tyler's needs and their family relationship. Thompson's experience navigating Tyler's recovery had motivated him to pursue training in child trauma advocacy, and he now worked with military family support organizations to help other service members recognize and address risks to their children. During deployment periods, Tyler, now 9 years old, had developed into a resilient and articulate child who understood his experiences in age-appropriate terms while maintaining healthy boundaries around discussion of Linda's criminal behavior and its impact on his life. His therapy had enabled him to process complex emotions about Linda while focusing on building positive relationships with adults who prioritized his safety and development. The educational support services that had been arranged for Tyler included specialized tutoring to address academic gaps created by his chaotic living situation with Linda, while enrichment programs had helped him develop interests and talents that provided positive outlets for his energy and creativity. Tyler's teachers reported that he was a thoughtful and empathetic student who often advocated for other children who appeared to be struggling with family or personal difficulties. Tyler's relationship with his father had deepened through their shared experience of recovery and rebuilding, while family therapy had helped them communicate effectively about difficult emotions and memories. Thompson's commitment to transparency and honesty about Tyler's experiences had created a foundation of trust that enabled Tyler to feel secure discussing his concerns and feelings without fear of judgment or abandonment. The broader policy implications of Linda's case had influenced federal legislation addressing the intersection of drug trafficking and child welfare. Senator Maria Gonzalez from Arizona had introduced the Children's Safety in Criminal Enterprises Act, which enhanced penalties for criminals who use children to facilitate illegal activities while providing additional resources for treatment and recovery services for affected children. The proposed legislation included provisions for specialized courts that would coordinate criminal prosecution with child welfare proceedings, ensuring that children's immediate safety and long-term recovery needs were addressed comprehensively rather than through separate systems that might not communicate effectively. The coordinated approach would prevent children from falling through gaps between criminal justice and family services while providing holistic support for recovery and protection. Congressional hearings on the proposed legislation had featured testimony from myself, Tyler's father, Dr. Amanda Foster, and federal law enforcement officials who had worked on Linda's case. The testimony emphasized that children used as shields for criminal activities required specialized support services that addressed both immediate trauma and long-term developmental needs that might not become apparent until years after their rescue. The Department of Health and Human Services had incorporated lessons learned from Tyler's case into new guidelines for child protective services agencies throughout the country. The guidelines emphasized the importance of recognizing when child neglect intersected with organized criminal activities, requiring coordination between local social services and federal law enforcement agencies to ensure comprehensive protection and appropriate prosecution of criminal behavior. The new CPS guidelines included training requirements for social workers to recognize signs that children were being used to facilitate adult criminal activities, while also providing protocols for coordination with law enforcement agencies that could address criminal behavior while protecting children's immediate safety and confidentiality. The training emphasized that criminal exploitation of children often involved sophisticated planning that required specialized investigative techniques and prosecutorial strategies. Federal drug enforcement agencies had used intelligence gathered through Linda's cooperation to disrupt cartel operations throughout the Southwest, resulting in dozens of additional prosecutions and significant disruption of methamphetamine distribution networks. The success of these operations had demonstrated the value of cooperation agreements that incentivized defendants to provide information about organized criminal activities while accepting responsibility for their own criminal behavior. The Drug Enforcement Administration had established specialized units focused on identifying and prosecuting criminals who used children to facilitate drug trafficking operations, recognizing that this form of criminal exploitation required enhanced investigative techniques in coordination with child welfare agencies. The specialized units combined traditional drug enforcement expertise with training in childhood trauma and family dynamics that enabled more effective identification and protection of endangered children. Linda's federal imprisonment had proceeded without significant incident, as her cooperation with federal authorities had been completed successfully and her information had contributed to multiple prosecutions that disrupted organized criminal activities. Federal Bureau of Prisons records indicated that Linda was participating in psychological treatment programs and addiction counseling, though her progress reports suggested limited insight into the long-term consequences of her criminal behavior. Medical evaluations conducted during Linda's imprisonment had documented severe neurological damage resulting from decades of methamphetamine use, including cognitive impairment that affected her ability to understand complex consequences of her actions and limited her capacity for developing empathy and emotional regulation skills. The medical findings provided context for understanding her criminal behavior while emphasizing that her cognitive limitations posed ongoing risks to any children who might come under her influence. Linda's scheduled release date, more than a decade in the future, would be preceded by comprehensive evaluation of her mental health status and risk assessment for potential danger to children and communities. The federal sentencing conditions included lifetime restrictions on unsupervised contact with children and mandatory participation in psychological treatment programs that would continue throughout her supervised release period. The question of Whether Linda would ever acknowledge the full scope of harm she had inflicted upon Tyler and other children remained unresolved, as her psychological evaluation suggested limited capacity for genuine insight and empathy. Mental health professionals working with Linda had noted that she continued to minimize her responsibility for criminal behavior while blaming external circumstances and other people for the consequences of her choices. My own relationship to Linda's imprisonment and its meaning for my personal development had evolved through extensive therapy and reflection that helped me process complex emotions about justice, forgiveness, and family relationships. The therapeutic work had enabled me to separate my professional responsibilities from personal feelings while maintaining appropriate boundaries around my role in Linda's prosecution and sentencing. The therapeutic process had also helped me understand that Linda's acknowledgement of my achievements during her preliminary hearing represented the closest approximation to maternal recognition that I would ever receive, while also recognizing that her criminal behavior toward Tyler demonstrated that she had not fundamentally changed from the person who had abandoned me 28 years earlier. This recognition provided closure while validating my decision to pursue judicial remedies rather than attempting family reconciliation. The completion of Linda's case had strengthened my commitment to child advocacy and judicial innovation while providing confidence that personal experience, when properly managed, could enhance rather than compromise professional effectiveness. The precedent established through my handling of the case had created opportunities for other judges with relevant personal backgrounds to contribute their insights to similar cases while maintaining appropriate ethical boundaries. The transformation from abandoned child to respected judge who protected other vulnerable children represented the fulfillment of motivations that had driven my educational and professional development throughout my adult life. The opportunity to ensure that Tyler received justice and protection that I had needed as a child provided profound personal satisfaction while demonstrating that individual experiences of trauma could be transformed into professional assets. For protecting others. As I continued my judicial career with enhanced understanding of complex family dynamics and criminal behavior, I carried forward the lessons learned from Linda's case while remaining committed to protecting vulnerable children and ensuring that justice would prevail over family dysfunction and criminal exploitation. The little girl who had once been powerless had become the judge who ensured that power would be used appropriately to protect those who could not protect themselves. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.